Hello, Marion Sigaut. Thank you for having us for this interview. Today, we are going to take some time to talk in detail about the topic of child sexual abuse as it existed before the French Revolution, and also to discuss what it eventually became in the period that followed afterwards. What it remained afterwards. So, how was child sexual abuse organized before?
The revolution. What I discovered, because no one had ever looked into the problem before me, I know this because I spent 2 years studying and combing through the archives of public assistance. So public assistance, that's the lost children, the foundlings, that's where it all happened. And I searched, I didn't find any studies on the subject. So I opened up, you could say, the subject with a research project. So what happened? I knew, because I had read about it, that in 1750, that is halfway through the reign of Louis XV, the police had taken children from the streets. There had been extremely serious riots, there had been a trial, there had been death sentences. In short, it was a really, really big affair. And I suspected, without the slightest bit of evidence, that these child abductions might have been for the purpose of a pedocriminal trafficking ring. Well, that was a false lead. A false lead, but the real trail was just behind it. That is to say, at that time, the police were abducting children to send them to the colonies because the Enlightenment, that great emancipatory movement everyone admires, had realized that the slave trade was becoming far too expensive. In other words, that black people. So when I say Negroes, that's how people spoke back then. It's not out of disrespect on my part, it's just the terminology of the time. So I'm using the terms from that era. Black people were becoming more and more expensive to acquire, and to solve the problem of cheap labor in the colonies, because that's what it was about, they came up with the idea, let's just take the children from the hospitals. We'll replace the black people in the colonies with the children from the hospitals. The children from the hospitals are children without parents, without family. So the child abductions that took place in 1750 were most likely to replace black people in the colonies. So it wasn't to supply a pedophile network, but I had a feeling that something else was going on anyway.
So, to put things in context, before the French Revolution, there were already hospitals in France.
Well, it's not hospitals, it's the General Hospital. That's what I'm going to explain. I knew there had been riots and children abducted. And I looked into it when I was studying history, when I was working on my master's thesis, what's now called a Master 1, on that period. I had a hunch that a man named Damien, who had attacked the king and had been horribly executed, might have had personal reasons for attacking the king, who was rumored to have a fondness for little girls. So I did some digging, I learned, because that's what I was at university for, that they were public assistance archives where all the children who were picked up were recorded. I started opening these big registers, which were the admission and discharge records for children at the General Hospital. I'll talk about its origins in a moment. And I looked there for the daughter of this famous Damien, who was supposedly kidnapped. Well, in one of his interrogations, he said his daughter had been taken, and I thought, if his daughter was kidnapped in 1750, that could be the reason why he attacked the king. So I started looking at what was happening in the records of the General Hospital, and that's where I discovered the real secret. So what is this real secret? What exactly is the General Hospital? Let's take a moment and jump back in time, traveling back a full century, all the way to the year 1652. The year 1652 marks the very beginning of the youth of the young Louis XIV of France. At this point in history, he hasn't yet come into his own as a ruler, and his reign is still in its early stages. There's a civil war shaking France, called the Fronde. And in 1652, some magistrates, actually, they started back in 1632. Yes, they started in 1632, and they presented their project to the king in 1654. Sorry, it's not 1652, it's 1654. So who are these magistrates? The magistrates say, there's a problem in France, and this problem is going to get even worse during the time of the Fronde, that is, the Civil War, because of a beggar class that's out of control. What's the beggar class? It's the poor. The poor who hang around in the cities and the countryside doing nothing. There's an organized beggar class, and they're what they call the courts of miracles. Do you know what a court of miracles is? You have beggars wandering the streets of Paris, and when they get to a building courtyard, suddenly they start walking normally. They take out their glass eye, and it turns out they have a real eye. The miracles, meaning that as soon as they enter the court of miracles, they suddenly become able-bodied again and everything. The courts of miracles are kind of a state within a state. It's the beggar class that robs passersby. It's a clear case of public disorder. So there are people who are zealots, who are devout, known as the Company of the Blessed Sacrament, who say, we want to rid the kingdom of all this filthy rabble. And they lump everyone together. That is, they're the beggars from the courts of miracles, but there are also the poor and the poor and the poor. And the poor during times of civil war are people who, if your village has been burned down, you have no home, you follow the bread. Why do people from the countryside go to the city? Because all the cities are supplied with bread. So if your house is burned down in the countryside, you follow the grain convoys and you go to the city where you'll be fed. That's how it goes. The cities are always supplied, especially Paris. Not supplying Paris with grain is unthinkable. So starting in 1632, there were magistrates, judges in the Parliament of Paris. The Parliament of Paris is a kind of high court, a sovereign court, made up of magistrates, high-ranking magistrates, whose mission is both to administer justice in the name of the king and also to record, that is, to enter into their register, all royal decisions. A royal decision is a law. A law is a royal decision, and a royal decision is a law. For a law to be enforceable, it has to be entered into the registers, and it's the magistrates who keep these registers. So they have the power to hassle, to make things difficult for the monarchy. If they drag their feet about registering a law, the law won't be enforceable if it isn't recorded. So there's an ongoing power struggle throughout the entire Ancien regime between the magistrates who resist the monarchy. The monarchy wants to be obeyed. That's what it's there for. The king, he's there.
For that, in opposition to the National Assembly.
Exactly. Except the magistrates, they're not there to make the laws. They're there to record them and to enforce them. To enforce the law, to deliver justice. So this desire the magistrates have to invent an institution that will rid the kingdom of beggary is in itself suspicious. It's not their business. It's not their business. But they create an institution, which will be called the General Hospital, and which has nothing to do with a Hotel Dieu. For the sick, it's the Hotel Dieu. The General Hospital is a place of confinement. It's confinement with a capital C, really. It's about being put in an asylum, in fact. The confinement of the poor, the destitute, the beggars, who are seen by these people as a social blight. Beggars are a nuisance. What is a beggar, after all, but a lazy person who's decided to... These people have absolutely no compassion whatsoever for misfortune. It's completely foreign to them. These are people who are... Everyone is Catholic in France at that time, but they are... Regularly, they think the church is too soft, that the archbishop shouldn't act that way. They're always lecturing others, telling the king what he should do, telling the pope what he should do. These people, they're a real pain.
They're conspiracy theorists.
Absolutely, absolutely. And they're the opposition of that era. So these magistrates, and it's not just magistrates, they're also bourgeois, people giving orders. These magistrates organized in a secret society called the Company of the Blessed Sacrament. They're zealots. They're people who say the Pope is not considered Catholic enough, the Archbishop is seen as being too lenient, but we are going to show you true moral rigor and a certain harshness toward the poor. So it takes them 9 years to draft the statutes for what will become the General Hospital. And in 1654 or 1656, the project is ready, the Civil War is over, and France needs to be soothed because the Fronde was a nightmare. The Fronde? They say it was troops marching through the countryside, beating the hell out of each other until everything was destroyed. It seems that during the Fronde, the armies on campaign, whether they were the nobles' armies or the king's or whoever's, left nothing behind for 40 kilometers. For 40 kilometers, they burned everything. They torched it all. It was horrific. My village, Alonsec, suffered a lot during the Fronde, and the village of Entrain over there was razed. Well, not razed, but set on fire, burned down. The Fronde was just dreadful. So when the young Louis XIV came to power, the magistrates who had made his life miserable throughout his childhood and during his mother's regency said to him, "Your Majesty, we have a plan to lock up the poor and solve the problem of beggary." And Louis XIV said, if that's all it takes to keep him quiet. He asks them to take care of the poor, and he signs. And what does he sign? He signs off on the creation and implementation of an absolutely atrocious system that forces all poor people, that is, anyone who can't prove they have a job and a permanent address, to be locked up in the general hospital. Women in one place, men in another, and children in a third location. That means you're married, you have kids, you lose your job, you're going to lose your wife, you're going to lose your kids, and you're going to lose your freedom, and you let yourself be locked up. And he...
How many people are locked up like that?
Thousands.
Do we have any numbers?
Yes. At Bicetre, there were 6,000. At La Salpêtrière, there were 6,000, just in Paris alone. And
the children?
The children? There were thousands of them. Thousands and thousands. So Louis XIV signs, and he signs in that. So first, probably not. Naivety. He wasn't naive, he just wasn't aware. Anyway, the thing was already underway. It can't predict what it's going to become. The magistrates who created the General Hospital made sure, by statute, that no outside interference could come in to see what was happening there. That is, the judges are both judge and party. If there are lawsuits against the General Hospital, they're the ones who will handle them. That means if you have a complaint against a magistrate who sits at the General Hospital, he's the one who will judge himself. In your opinion, what are the chances he'll find himself guilty? And the most horrifying thing I discovered while analyzing the statutes of the General Hospital is that the magistrates automatically become the legal guardians of all the children who enter the General Hospital, even if they're in their mother's hands or arms.
So basically, when children are born at the General Hospital at that time, their guardian is automatically a magistrate?
Yes, their guardians are indeed the magistrates, such as those appointed. From the hospital's board of directors and administration.
Do we know under what conditions these children grow up from birth?
Absolutely. It's atrocious. Atrocious.
What do you mean?
It's atrocious. They're put in filthy dormitories. First, they're separated from their mothers. There are actually relatively few children born at the General Hospital. Instead of letting them be nursed by their mothers, they're separated from their mothers and sent to another institution called La Couche, which was originally created by the extraordinary St. Vincent de Paul. He was called Monsieur Vincent at the time. He became a saint 100 years later. But Monsieur Vincent was absolutely determined to help the poor, to assist the poor, to make sure the poor were less poor and didn't suffer. Whereas all those bastards from the Company of the Blessed Sacrament, what they wanted was for the poor to really suffer. Sorry for the strong language. For them to really suffer. And to make them pay for their misery. So who are these magistrates? What is this Company of the Blessed Sacrament? Up until 1660, the Company of the Blessed Sacrament ruled supreme at the General Hospital. Starting in 1660, Louis XIV realized that the Company of the Blessed Sacrament was a kind of state within the state, and he banned the Company of the Blessed Sacrament. And at that moment, Jansenist magistrates took over the General Hospital. So what is Jansenism? Well, Jansenism is the darling of the entire French left. And let me tell you, I paid the price to find that out. It got censored at the university. Vastly. But I have the evidence. I could show it if needed. I was strongly urged to stop saying what I was saying about the Jansenists, even though I have all the evidence. I absolutely have all the evidence. All the evidence. So Jansenists are basically Protestants who don't admit that they are. That is to say, it's a form of Protestantism that hasn't broken away from Rome. So what exactly is Protestantism? It's a theology, which is as respectable as any other. I don't agree with them, but let's just say, it's a theology that says each person, guided by their own conscience, will know what is right and wrong, whereas Catholicism says it's the ecclesiastical hierarchy that determines right and wrong. In other words, the Catholic submits to what the Pope says, while the Protestant says, it's my conscience. My conscience. I handle it however I want.
So at that point, are all the magistrates Jansenists?
No, there's only a Jansenist minority.
And what kind of power does this minority?
Of Jansenist, Jan? This Jansenist minority, first of all, runs the General Hospital, and they forbid anyone from coming in to see what's going on.
So we have the Jansenist magistrates of the time, who are a minority among the magistrates, but who run and control the General Hospital.
Absolutely. The General Hospital, And the Foundling Hospital. So the Foundling Hospital was created by Monsieur Vincent, by Vincent de Paul. It's hard for me to call him saint at a time when it's not yet organized. Yes, my dear, the Foundling Hospital is the work of Vincent de Paul, which consists of finding a refuge for abandoned children. And why do mothers abandon their children? I checked. I went to the Paris archives to find the paper notes attached to the swaddling clothes of abandoned children. The mothers who abandon their children do so to save them. To save them.
Save them from what?
From famine.
All right.
Because they can no longer raise them. They can no longer raise them. A woman who doesn't have a husband to feed her, who has lost her husband or whose husband is absent, if she has a small child and she's forced to work, if she works as she does. These are cases of mothers abandoning their children to the institution. And Vincent had made sure that these children were fed. He invented a wet nurse system. And after Mr. Vincent died, the General Hospital took over. And it was horrific. It was horrific.
How long exactly did this system last in tow?
Until the revolution. So just how long did this system last? And at a time when there were no social networks, no telephones, no news channels, how did the people become aware, stay informed about what was happening to the children at the General Hospital? The General Hospital was in Paris, and there was also Bicêtre. At Kremlin-Bicêtre for men, and the Salpêtrière in Paris, next to what is now. That's the General Hospital. The Salpêtrière is still in the same place today, but back then it was bigger, taking up the area where the Austerlitz train station is now. So the Salpêtrière was on the outskirts of Paris. For example, children who came from Auxerre would be put on barges that traveled all the way to Paris, up the Seine, and there they would go straight from the barge into the General Hospital without passing through the customs gate, meaning without any inspection. And once they were in there, I checked, I went to look at the records, within 3 months they were dead. Can you imagine? Can you find out what they died of? And then, for what reason would a city like Auxerre send children to Paris when in Paris they're looking for wet nurses out in the countryside? If that's not child trafficking, then what is it? What is it? So I discovered all of this. So the magistrates were the guardians of all the children who were born or who entered the General Hospital. So the children born at the General Hospital were separated from their mothers and sent to the nursery. And the General Hospital, the Salpêtrière, was, you know where the Gare d'Austerlitz is? There were nights when the screams of pain and revolt from the women in the petri dish awakened by the screams of pain of the vault. They were so badly mistreated. It's horrific. It's like a concentration camp. It's like a concentration camp. These were women who were subjected to appalling schedules. They lived in absolutely atrocious hygienic conditions. Injustice, beatings, torture. It's atrocious. It's atrocious. To really study the daily life in the General Hospital is to study the daily life in a concentration camp.